Well, good morning. Hope you're all doing well. Well, hey, we're starting a new series today. It's going to go about 8 weeks, and it's going to be all about soul health, soul and mental health and relational health, you name it, because we need it, don't we? We need it right now. And, it's a little bit like the old urban legend, which I think is actually true, about the frog in the kettle. If you toss a frog into a pot of boiling water, it'll jump right out. But if you put a frog in a lukewarm water, it'll just sit there and get all relaxed, think it's a little frog hot tub until it's too late and it boils. And that's kind of what's happening to us in our culture today. And I think probably around the world. The other night at our Stephen Ministry Continuing Ed, we had a local counselor come in and talk to us and saying, one of the things that people are struggling with most today is isolation, loneliness, and fear. The loneliness, about 3 or 4 years ago, there was this thing that happened called COVID, and it was a pandemic, and we were told to isolate from each other because if you don't, you might die. And very real stuff, but I think there's still trauma as a result of that. And, I was reading some stuff. I read too much, which is part of my problem with my soul. I read too much of the wrong things, news. And I was reading a couple of articles that said, loneliness is as bad for your health as smoking. And also, another article I read says, loneliness is as bad for your health as heart disease. And I'm like, that's pretty bad. That's pretty serious. And regularly, in my line of work, I see the results of that, the carnage that is all around us. So we thought, let's dive into this, let's address it. And today we're going to I'd like to lay a foundation for what the soul is and, how it works and all that. So put your thinking caps on, sit straight in your chairs, drink as much coffee as you need to. I'm going to be reading a lot, talking a lot, presenting a lot in a pretty short period of time. But I'm going to start by reading a story that many of you are probably familiar with. Peter Marshall shared this story. He was the U.S. Senate chaplain, and in 1952, he shared this story with the Senate. It's called The Keeper of the Stream. There once was a town high in the Alps that straddled the banks of a beautiful stream. The stream was fed by springs that were old as earth and deep as the sea. The water was clear like crystal. Children laughed and played beside it. Swans and geese swam on it. You could see the rocks and the sand and the rainbow trout that swarmed at the bottom of the stream. High in the hills, far beyond anyone's sight, lived an old man who served as keeper of the springs. He had been hired so long ago that no one could really remember a time when he wasn't there. He would travel from one spring to another in the hills, removing branches or falling leaves or debris that might pollute the water, but his work was unseen. One year, the town council decided they had better things to do with their money, so no one supervised the old man anyway. They had roads to repair, taxes to collect, and services to offer. And giving money to an unseen stream cleaner had become a luxury they could no longer afford. So the old man left his post. High in the mountains, the springs were untended. Twigs and branches and worse muddied the liquid flow. Mud and silt compacted the creek bed. Farm waste turned parts of the stream into stagnant bogs. For a time, no one in the village noticed, but after a while, the water was not the same. It began to look brackish. The swans flew away to live elsewhere. The water no longer had a crisp scent that drew children to play by it. Some people in the town began to grow ill, but all noticed the loss of sparkling beauty that used to flow between the banks of the streams that fed the town. The life of the village depended on the stream, and the life of the stream depended on the keeper. The city council reconvened, the money was found, the old man was rehired. After yet another time, the springs were clean, the stream was pure, children played again on its banks, illness was replaced by health, the swans came home, and the village came back to life. The life of a village depended on the health of the stream. The stream is your soul, and you are the keeper. One of the things that I think is creating tremendous anxiety in our culture is there are so many things that seem to be out of our control, and in fact they are, and we read about them day after day, and it's called doom scrolling. We watch the news, we hear the bad reports, and we have very little control over what Russia might do in Ukraine. We have very little control over someone carrying a weapon into a mall and shooting people. We have very little control over things like that. And that creates anxiety. And, having the worry gene, if I figure if I read stuff and I'm informed and I worry about it, somehow or another it's going to get better, or I'm going to have some control over it, but I don't. And so what I'm going to suggest we do is control what we can control. And the health of our souls is one of those things that we do have a say in, if we allow God to have a say in it. But I think we have to have a proper understanding of what the soul is. In his excellent book, Renovation of the Heart, Dallas Willard writes, "Our soul is like a stream of water which gives strength, direction, and harmony to every other area of life. When that stream is as it should be, we are constantly refreshed and exuberant in all we do, because our soul itself is then profusely rooted in the vastness of God and his kingdom, including nature and all else within us as enlivened and directed by that stream. Therefore, we are in harmony with God, reality, and the rest of human nature, and nature at large." And there are a lot of different ideas about the soul. If you were to ask the average person, well, what's your soul? And even if you'd ask theologians, what's your soul? You'd probably get some different opinions. I remember the prayer. I'm not even growing up in a Christian home. I think most of us prayed this bedtime prayer as children. Remember, it goes something like this: "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Now, that's a moderately terrifying prayer for a 7-year-old, which explains so many counseling centers in our world today. But the soul. So what is the soul? I remember watching cartoons, Looney Tunes as a kid, the Roadrunner and stuff, and when he'd die his 10th death of the episode, you'd see his soul float out of his body, but to again be reconnected. You think about in athletics, the heart and soul of the team is so-and-so. But what is the soul? And today I want to kind of dig into that, because I think if we don't have a proper understanding of the soul, it's going to be hard for us to really understand how to keep our souls healthy and to get our souls healthy. So for you visual learners, we're going to kind of use some circles to kind of try to paint a picture of what the soul is. And really, the soul, in the simplest term, is the control center of who we are as human beings. It's the control center. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, in the King James Version, the writer puts it this way: "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living soul." God breathed our souls into our bodies at conception. As we relate to one another, we relate to one another as souls. That's who you are. That's your personality, your emotions, your will, your drive, all of those things. It's kind of the center of, it's control central. It's who you are, your soul. If I'm interacting with you and it was just organic, it'd be like a couple pieces of meat just kind of interacting with each other. But it's what's inside of us that God placed in there that makes us human. And that's how we identify with one another. That's how we love one another. That's how we have feelings and emotions for one another. It's more than just neuroscience. Dallas Willard, again, talks about it this way. He said, "What is running your life at any given moment is your soul. Not external circumstances, not your thoughts, not your intentions, not even your feelings, but your soul. The soul is the aspect of your whole being that correlates, integrates, and enlivens everything going on in the various dimensions of the self. The soul is the life center of human beings." So let's kind of try to look at this in a picture form, because, if you're going to care for something, you have to try to understand it, right? If you're going to care for a child, you have to try to understand a child. If you're going to care for your car, it's good to have some understanding of what all those little lights are on your dashboard. If you're going to care for your bicycle, you need to know a little something about it. So you got to know something about your soul in order to care for it properly. So let's use a visual picture to kind of explain this. So the first circle I'm going to put on the screen represents our will. So when you think of the will, it is the most basic part of our being that separates us from non-beings. We share a will with the animal kingdom. Animals have a will, the will to survive, the will to reproduce. It's the lowest part of our nature, our will. And so we all have a will, and our will is what makes us not a thing, but a being. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, then God said, let us make human beings in our image to be like us. They will reign over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, wild animals, small animals, etc., etc., etc. God gave us a will to begin to have dominion over the other beings of the universe. Now, I know there are people today who would take exception to what I'm saying. It's like, well, we're all one, like trees and grass and all that kind of stuff. No, trees don't have a will, I don't really think. They're not beings, they're live, but they don't have a being. Anyway, animals do. Humans do. But here's the deal. Our wills help us do things, make commitments, move, get married, exercise, study, etc. But it's not good at controlling or it's not good at controlling our attitudes and our habits. That's why people say, well, I lack the willpower. That's why resolutions fail, because we make it all about our will. I'm going to will myself to change, but our will is so bound to our sinful, fallen, basic nature that it's always warring against what it is we want to do. Why is that? Well, let's go to the second circle, and we'll see this represents the mind. So you have your will, which is what causes you, it's the most basic level of being. It's kind of your instincts. And then you have the mind, which actually is what separates us from the animal kingdom. Your mind is a higher level of consciousness where we are the only beings on the face of the earth. And I know some would take exception to this. That's okay. I don't care. That's what separates us from the animal kingdom. We are aware of the fact that we're mortal. We have a higher level of consciousness, awareness about life and things and all of that. And that's why we can steward well this earth. And this is our conscious self. It's less primal. It's less primal than the instinct or the will. Now, we have a will, and that makes us aware of some things. And Paul talks about this will in Romans chapter 8. And I'll just read it to you, and then I'm going to kind of flesh it out a little bit for you. He says, those who are dominated by the sinful nature. Now, don't get hung up on sinful nature. He's not talking about like sins. He's talking about the basic human, carnal, fleshly nature. The lowest level, our will. Just how we react, that will to survive. That instinct, the instincts, okay? That's what he's talking about. Those who are dominated by their lower nature, their sinful nature, think about sinful things, fleshly things. But those who are controlled by the Holy Spirit think about things that please the Spirit. So, letting your sinful nature or your will control your mind leads to death. But letting the Spirit, capital S, Holy Spirit, God's Spirit, control your mind leads to life and peace. For the sinful nature, the lower nature, the will is always hostile or in competition with God. It never did obey God's laws, and it never will. You see, our mind is the source of our desires, and it never stops. Your mind never stops. Are you ever reminded of that when you wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and your mind is going a million miles an hour, and you're like, just shut up. You can't shut it off. And the will isn't very good at controlling that. But the soul is. And here's where we come in. Here's the question, the $1 million question. What are you feeding your mind? Are you allowing your will to have the day? Are you allowing your will to dominate your mind, your thinking, your lower self, your carnal nature, your basic instincts? Are you allowing that, or are you feeding your mind with something better and healthier and higher and more truthful? You have control over that. I have control over that. That's an area of life we have control over, what we feed our minds. Just like we have control, believe it or not, over what we eat. You really do have control over that, by the way. But if you allow your will is going to lose. So it's the same way. What are you feeding your mind, which leads to the third circle, the third part of our being. This is where it's lived out. This represents our bodies. So you got your will, your most basic instinct, your mind, which is a higher level of consciousness, and then you've got your body, and in a world of time and space with these dimensions, this is the mechanism, this is the vehicle or delivery system in a world of time and space. This is the power pack, in other words. This is how we live out our lives. The body is amazing at doing a lot of things, and it can do a lot. It can drive a car, it can ride a bike, it can tie a shoe. It is amazing at doing a lot of stuff. But many people in the world today are increasingly seeing that the body is that's it. That's all we've got. We're just all flesh. I mean, all this spiritual stuff and life after death experiences and, all this stuff, it's just all neuroscience. I beg to differ. We have a soul that is connected to the God, the creator of the universe. And I beg to differ with the world. It's like, well, it's just all neuroscience, just all this. I believe in neuroscience, but that just all happened? Really? Which leads to the whole package. When you put the whole person together, then you have a fourth circle, which represents our soul. And the soul is what everything else is put together in. So if you think about it this way, our soul integrates all of the other parts of our being. Our soul pulls together our will, our mind, and our bodies so that we are an integrated person. And when that becomes disrupted, which is happening every day in our world right now, what happens? We become disintegrated. When you think of, well, that just disintegrated, it just fell apart. That's exactly what's happening. That's what an unhealthy soul looks like. A disintegrated person where your will, your mind, your body, your soul, they're not working together, they're working against it themselves. And this is what is happening more and more in our world today. John Ortberg talks about this in his excellent book, Soul Keeping, and he says, the soul seeks harmony, connection, and integration. That is why integrity is such a deep soul word. The human soul seeks to integrate our will and our mind and our body into a whole or integral person. Beyond that, the soul seeks to connect us with other people, with creation, and with God himself, who made us to be rooted in him the way a tree is rooted by a life-giving stream. This is what our soul is. This is what our soul does. In the Old Testament and the New Testament, the word soul in the original languages is synonymous with person or human. Soul is what makes you human, the kind of human that connects with the God of the universe. And Ortberg goes on to say, and says, your soul is what integrates your will, which are your intentions, your mind, which are your thoughts and feelings, values and conscience, and your body, which is your face, body language, and actions, into a single life. A soul is healthy when there is harmony between these three entities and God's intent for all creation. Now listen to this. This last sentence he makes just blew me away, because you talk about timely. You talk about relevant. He says, when you are connected with God and other people in life, you have a healthy soul. What is happening in our world today? The exact opposite of that. The more disconnected we become from God and each other, the unhealthier we become. I mean, look around. You don't have to be whatever a rocket scientist is, it's the old saying. You don't have to be a genius to see this. The farther we move from God and the farther we move from each other, the sicker we become. I mean, how many ways do we have to see that play out before we realize what the problem with the world is? It's our souls. And Paul, in a very self-effacing way, he tells us what that looks like when that happens, about his own life. So the trouble is not with the law, Romans chapter 7. The trouble is not with the law, for it is spiritual and good. The trouble's with me. For I am all too human, a slave to sin, a slave to my carnal, lowest self will. I don't really understand myself, for I want to do what is right, but I don't do it. Instead, I do what I hate, but if I know that what I am doing is wrong, this shows that I agree that the law is good. So I am not the one doing wrong. It is sin, the will, the most carnal, lowest form of me that does it. And I know that nothing good lives in me, that is, in my sinful nature, and what he's saying is apart from Christ. I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. But if I do what I don't want to do, I am not really the one doing it. It is sin living in me that does it. That's a pretty explicit statement. This is why good people do bad things. You know, when you talk about somebody losing their soul, I don't believe we're talking about their salvation. That person lost their soul. No, they lost themselves. They lost who they are. They've lost their identity. Parker Palmer, who's a writer, talks about how back in the day, farmers in the Midwest, when a blizzard was on the horizon, would tie a rope or connect a rope from their house to their barn so that when they go out to do chores, they wouldn't get lost in a blizzard and freeze to death in their own yard, which there are cases of that happening. And he talks about the blizzard of our souls. He says, he writes about the blizzard of the world. And he says, it's the fear and frenzy and deceit and indifference to the suffering of others that separates us from our own souls and our moral bearings. What we need, he said, is a rope from the back door to the barn so we can find our way home again. When we catch sight of the soul, we can survive the blizzard without losing our hope and our way. We live on a planet of lost souls. How did this happen? How did we get here? I think there's a very simple answer. We have moved from soul to self. Did you realize the word psychology comes from the Greek word psyche, which actually means soul? That ought to be what psychology is about, apart from what anyone thinks about religion. Sigmund Freud wrote that the treatment of the psyche means treatment of the soul. One could also understand it to mean treatment of sickness when it occurs in the life of the soul. But psychology has focused on the self, and self carries a totally different connotation than soul. To focus on my soul means to look at my life under the care and connection of God. To focus on myself apart from God means losing awareness of what matters most. Martin Seligman, a brilliant psychologist, has a theory. He says, we have replaced church, faith, and community with a tiny little unit that cannot bear the weight of meaning. That's the self. We're all about the self. We revolve our lives around our self. True or false? You ever heard of this thing called a selfie? Which is destroying people. I was shocked this past winter when I was out Colorado skiing. Every day I was out there, I would see people skiing or snowboarding down these steep mountains doing selfies. I'm like, what is wrong with you? And I didn't think it's just because I'm a baby boomer. I'm like, first of all, you're missing the whole thing. You're missing the beauty. And secondly, that is very dangerous. I mean, I just want to go up and slap the thing out of their hand. Then I'd get arrested for, But it's me. I care less about the mountains and the beauty of creation and skiing or snowboarding than I do. I want people to see that I want them to see my highlight reel. And you know what that's doing? It's killing young women and young men. Because every day you're comparing your life to somebody else's highlight reel. And it is destroying us because we're becoming so myopic, so self-focused. It's all about me too. You do you, I'll do me. Me, and it is making us sick at a deep soul level. And we're like the frog in the kettle. We don't even realize it's happening. We've replaced our souls with ourselves, and it's literally killing us. Jesus was asked once, what's the most important commandment? No surprise, Matthew 22. He replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love God, love others. When we quit loving God, we quit loving each other, what do we have? Disease, sickness, rising suicide rates, addiction, you name it. Because our souls are becoming sick and sick and sick, and we don't even realize it. So what I want to do as we close our time together today is begin a practice. And I think it's so important. What are you feeding your mind? If it's not being fed, if your soul is not being fed by God and His truth, what is it being fed by? Something else. It could be a lot of different things. But part of our problem is we got to, all of us, myself included, we got to dial down the volume. We got to dial down the volume in our lives. We are living at in such a loud world that we can't even hear ourselves think, let alone God, let alone each other. And then we're on the heels of this horrible thing that happened 3 years ago. I mean, it was horrible. The world shut down. We went into isolation because we were told if we didn't, we were going to die or kill somebody. Now, that is not a political statement. That's just what happened. And we haven't recovered from that, you guys. People are still living in fear and isolation. And that is that's a deadly combination. And where the healing starts is in the arms of our Savior. When we go before Him in stillness and ask Him for help. The psalmist wrote about this in Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. And that literally means cease striving, and then you will know me. I will be honored by every nation. I will be honored throughout the world. And what I'd love for us to do collectively this morning is I would like us to do that. I would like us to be still and know God. And you know, I was thinking about this message and we were kind of planning the service, and there's an old hymn that's been remade, probably numerous times, that I absolutely love. And you probably know it. It's called Be Still, My Soul. It's right out of Psalm 46:10. And I would love for us to just collectively stand together and close our time out today by singing those words and allowing those words to come back to us at a soul level. Be still, my soul.